Hello, good morning. My name is Brian Kingston. I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Canada's auto industry is under enormous pressure as tariffs and trade uncertainty upend one of our most important economic sectors. Auto's importance to Canada and Ontario specifically cannot be overstated. The industry directly employs more than 125,000 people in vehicle assembly, parts, research, and development. An additional 370,000 people are employed in the aftermarket services and dealership networks. With over 90% of Canadian production destined for the United States, there is no industry without U.S. access and North American integration. Diversification is not an option for automotive, as markets in Europe and Asia are better served by assembly plants in those regions. Canada's market alone is too small to justify large-scale manufacturing. The future of Canada's auto industry and the hundreds of thousands of jobs that it supports depends on securing our trade relationship with the United States. This means the removal of the Section 232 tariffs and the renewal of CUSMA, or Trilateral Trade Agreement. Given these realities, the federal government's decision to open the Canadian market to Chinese EVs is deeply concerning. The Canada-China Strategic Partnership has the potential to undermine Canada's auto sector and presents risks to the future of our integrated North American automotive supply chain. As the Premier has outlined, it is critical that the federal government rectifies this situation by taking immediate action to bolster the competitiveness of the very companies that have been building cars and employing Canadians for over 100 years. Step one is repealing the costly and redundant EV sales mandate. Under the new Canada-China Strategic Partnership, Chinese manufacturers that do not build cars in Canada or employ Canadians will receive up to $980 million per year in compliance credits. These compliance credits will be paid for by the very companies that operate here, taking money that could be reinvested in Canada, in Ontario, and sending it to China. Step two is taking action to make Canada more competitive for auto. We must urgently lower the cost of investing in plants, machinery, and R&D to give Canada an edge over other jurisdictions. The future of Canada's auto industry hangs in the balance. The actions that we take now will determine whether or not we have an industry for 100 more years. Thank you.
Good morning, my friends, and I'm very proud to be here with the Premier, who has been a staunch partner of the Canadian auto sector, centered here in Ontario and this government through tough times and good times. I'm here with my partners and friends in the vehicle manufacturers, as well as in Canadian labor. What did we do last week with China? We gave tariff-free access to about 3% of the Canadian home market to importers who will not have to have any Canadian content in them, who do not have any Canadian content in them to date. That's raw materials, that's supplies, that's technology stacks in the vehicles. And we made an agreement to have them invest here, potentially to cover the concession that we made. Those partners are not the same as the ones that make cars here and make cars in Europe and in other Western countries. These are state-directed and owned companies who access the balance sheet of China to be able to compete for market share. The key objective has been market share, and we've watched them grow very quickly when they enter a market. The reason that we've put 100% tariffs in place in partnership with the Americans and then with the Mexicans is to help to seed EV investments in this region and have them bear fruit before those products inevitably poured over the tariff wall. We spent the last year defending that market and defending those supports against an unprecedented pressure from the White House and a pullback on that market. Making that concession in this moment makes the entire Canadian auto sector on shakier ground. And the Prime Minister is the Prime Minister for the entire country and balancing off a bunch of interests. And the people in the ag sector who celebrated that they had a return of about $3 billion of market access for their goods, that's a positive. But 50,000 vehicles from China at the current rate is that $3 billion. And so the concession is directly to the market prospects of the companies that we're trying to bolster at a time when we're under unprecedented pressure. 50,000 cars is about a shift at an auto plant. And a shift is 1,000 workers. It might be 5,000 supplier workers. So the challenge now is if they're inside the gate, what are we going to do to bolster the capabilities of Canadian suppliers who have hundreds of millions of dollars of capital at risk in this country and in the U.S. and in Mexico, employing 100,000 people here and another 100,000 Americans and Mexicans. At a time when we're renegotiating the full access in the USMCA for cars without a tariff, we've got to manage that risk, not just from a practical sense, but from a political sense, from a president who doesn't see the world in the way that we see it. When we started in this business 100 years ago, we started as an opportunity for companies to jump a tariff wall to sell to the British Commonwealth countries. As we evolved through the 60s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, it was strong market players with strong product and a free market, and opening new markets through a WTO and trade agreements was going to give Canadian companies, Canadian suppliers, Canadian workers an opportunity to sell the best product in the world to the customer with the highest disposable income. That world has changed. And every single country's automotive sector has a federal government as a partner, some in times of trouble, some permanent investments like some of the Germans, and some, the federal government is the automotive sector. Our government, our industry, our workforce can't be naive to what we've just allowed in exchange for another consideration on the other side of Canada. And we've got to spend the next 3 years being really vigilant that the guardrails that we announced, we will enforce. And if they don't live up to joint venture investment, if they don't live up to caps, to the market that we've given away, then we should be confident enough to say thank you and good night. I'm here with partners in this fight for the benefit of Canadians who put food on the table, put kids in school, in jobs that do that comfortably. But those jobs don't exist comfortably in this new world, and I'm glad that we're working together. Next is the national president of UNIFOR, a prodigious Canadian who has been a very good partner in giving this message, sending this message around the world, but also right down to the shop floor, Lana Payne.
Good morning, and thank you to Premier Ford and to my partners here in the auto industry for this invitation to be here today, along with obviously Flavio and Brian. As you all know, UNIFOR is Canada's largest private sector union with 320,000 members in every sector of the economy, including 40,000 in the auto sector right here in Ontario. And like so many workers who've been impacted by the tariffs from the Trump administration, auto workers are extremely, extremely worried about their future. We have been building vehicles in this country for more than 100 years. Our members are proud of what they do. As long as Canadians want to buy cars and trucks, we want to build them right here in Canada. Auto workers have been on the front lines of this trade war since last February, fighting to protect their jobs, their plants, and their communities. And that's why this China deal is a hard pill for them to swallow right now, because they've seen this movie before, where their jobs end up on the chopping block because of some trade negotiation. Opening up the Canadian market to cheap China-owned EVs worsens the situation we have already, where more and more countries in Canada. we cannot sustain an auto industry or the jobs that depend on it if vehicles are no longer built here. Given China's massive, and I say massive, overcapacity in EV production, there is little reason for those companies to establish real and meaningful manufacturing operations in our country. As of today, we have given market access without guarantees or any real commitments. And even if investment were to materialize, experience in other parts of the world shows the core supply chain remains in China, supported by heavy state subsidies, as Flavio has said, very, very low wages and suspect labor conditions, while parts are shipped in for final assembly. This model creates few jobs and fails to establish a meaningful or durable industrial base. Look, there's no sugarcoating this. We are in the fight of our lives here, fending off Trump's tariffs, and that fight just got a little harder. We must collectively come together to stabilize and protect the auto sector we have so we can actually have a future one. It is, after all, foundational to an advanced manufacturing sector in this country and indeed our entire industrial economy. Failing to defend today's auto jobs and supply chains and manufacturing capacity means surrendering the future of the industry altogether. And it is workers, the people who I represent, who will pay the heaviest price. Indeed, they are already paying the heaviest price. Right now, 2 Canadian auto plants are currently idled. GM CAMI Assembly in Ingersoll and Stellantis Brampton Assembly. We were on a path to build affordable EVs at Brampton, but that also means we must all work together to make Stellantis live up to its commitment. We have been building the EV future with investments in places like Windsor at the Nexstar battery plant and in St. Thomas with PowerCo's facility. Yet, right now, nearly 4,000 UNIFOR members are without work, with further losses rippling throughout the supply chain. In addition to Ingersoll and Brampton, the upcoming elimination of a shift at General Motors in Oshawa will impact more than 1,000 workers at that assembly plant and also along the auto parts chain. It's devastating out there. And yes, the root of the problem are Trump's tariffs. Make no mistake about that. No one has been clearer about that than this union from day one to today. The immediate priority for all of us, for the auto sector, must be to get these plants back into operation and stabilize this sector for the workers who depend on it. That must be job one. The federal government is expected to announce details of a new auto policy in the coming weeks, and we know that Minister Jolie has been working very hard at this. Automakers that build and assemble vehicles and support jobs in Canada should be rewarded as long as they live up to their commitments to the workers of Canada. But the free ride has to end for companies that enjoy full access to our markets while investing nothing in Canadian production. Today, more than 40% of the cars and trucks sold in Canada are made by automakers with zero, absolutely zero manufacturing footprint here. That is not sustainable. The China deal just made that situation worse. Any credible federal auto policy must come down to a simple rule. If you want to sell vehicles in Canada, you need to build in Canada and employ Canadian workers. This is our message as a union, and we're sending it loud and clear on behalf of the tens and thousands of Canadian auto workers who are depending on action. Now, I'd like to turn things over to Premier Doug Ford, who has been fighting every single day with us to defend this auto industry and the jobs of auto workers all across this province. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lana. Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking our guests. You just heard from Lana Payne, UNIFOR National President, Flavio Volpe, President of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association, and Brian Kingston, President and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Together, Lana, Flavio, and Brian represent the workers, the automakers, and parts makers across the auto supply chain. This is an industry that employs 500,000 workers, many of them unionized, and contributes nearly $16 billion to Canada's economy. Together, we're sending a united message about the need to stand up in defense of Canada's economy, our auto workers, and workers across our great province. Over the last few days, we've watched as President Trump has threatened Greenland, he's threatened Canada, he's threatened NATO allies. President Trump remains relentless in his campaign to create a more unstable, unsafe, and uncertain world. There's never been a more important time for Team Canada to stay united. There's never been a more important time to deliver on our plan to protect Ontario. Last week, Prime Minister Carney announced a deal with China that will allow thousands of cheap, made-in-China electric vehicles into Canada's market. I've been clear about my concerns with this deal. By opening up our country to a flood of cheap, made-in-China vehicles, the federal government is asking Canadian auto workers to compete on unfair ground. We've seen what happens when cheap Chinese vehicles enter Western markets. Factories have closed, workers have lost their jobs. That's the risk this deal is creating right here in Ontario. In exchange for opening Canada up to this flood of cheap Chinese vehicles, the federal government got nothing, absolutely nothing in return for Canadian auto workers. And that's why we're here today. My focus and the focus of the leaders with me today is to find a solution that works for all Canadians. We need to find a path forward that protects Canadian auto workers and good-paying union jobs. Instead of importing vehicles, we should be making vehicles by Canadian workers, using Canadian steel, respecting Canadian specs and standards, leveraging Canada's supply chain. And if the Chinese are serious about making investments and creating auto jobs here in Canada, then show us proof. Canadian auto workers can't feed their families with hypothetical commitments about investments that might happen 5 years or a decade from now. They need concrete investments that will create jobs now and support Canadian workers and their families. These investments should be at the heart of any deal between Canada and China. If the federal government had consulted Ontario or the leaders who are here with me today, we would have made that very, very clear. That's why my message to Prime Minister Carney: consult us, work with us, help us protect Canadian auto workers together as United Team Canada. That starts with eliminating the federal electric vehicle mandate, which is only making our auto sector less competitive. We need to align Canada's regulations with key trading partners and scrap federal fees that make it more expensive to build and buy made-in-Ontario vehicles. Our auto sector is under attack. Hundreds of thousands of good-paying, unionized Canadian jobs are on the line. Let's come together. Let's support, defend, and fight for Canada's auto sector. Let's protect Canadian workers. And in a very unstable world right now that we've all seen on television, let's provide Canadians the certainty, the stability, and support they deserve. Thank you, and may God bless the people of Ontario.
We will now take questions from the media. Media present can line up behind me and ask their questions through the microphone. As a friendly reminder, the format is one question, one follow-up. Please state your name and your outlet before your question.
Premier Ford, Megan Fitzpatrick from CBC News. Did you have a chance to watch President Trump's speech this morning in Switzerland? What did you make of his comments that Canada only lives because of the U.S. and that Prime Minister Carney should have expressed more gratitude to the United States?
Well, that's typical President Trump. He goes out on the attack constantly. Maybe he should look at the Amcan fortress that we propose. We'd make two countries, the greatest two countries in the world, the strongest, the wealthiest two countries. It's disappointing to see him on a full attack. Putting the Canadian flag, the American flag over Canada, over Greenland, it's unacceptable the way he speaks. Why doesn't he look at the nickel, the 70% of the nickel that comes from Sudbury to keep his military going, manufacturing, and aerospace and manufacturing? Why doesn't he look at the uranium that comes from Saskatchewan and gets refined in Port Hope? Why doesn't he look at the potash that's coming from Saskatchewan to keep its farmers going? How about the aluminum coming from Quebec? That's what he should be looking at. He's fortunate to have us. We love our American friends south of the border. There's one person that's causing upheaval, not just here in Canada, but around the world, and that's President Trump. As I've said numerous times, I've talked to Republicans, I talked to Democrats. They both feel the exact same way. You don't attack your closest friend, your closest neighbor, and your number one customer in the world. Yes, they're our number one customer, but we're their number one customer. Just alone in Ontario, 9 million Americans wake up every morning, produce a product or a widget or a service for Ontario. So maybe someone should inform him a little more than what he's being informed right now. We're critical partners on many areas in supply chains.
Premier Ford, Mark McAllister from City News. Just to follow up on that, you're very critical of Prime Minister Carney right now based on this deal with China. What did you make of his comments yesterday and his speech yesterday? He seemed to command the interest of the world in saying what he did yesterday, all the while you've been quite critical.
Well, I wouldn't say I was critical of the Prime Minister. I was very, very disappointed, as my colleagues behind me are very disappointed not to get a phone call, not to get a text message, and cutting a deal. And God bless the people in Saskatchewan. I love them out west, out east, in the fisheries. But the three of us, we have to take care of Ontario here. That's my number one job, to protect the people of Ontario. Protect their jobs, protect communities, and that's what I'm going to continue to do.
Alison Jones, Canadian Press. Just to follow up on that, you've been perhaps not critical, as you say, but disappointed in Prime Minister Carney's approach to Chinese EVs. Do you support his approach to global relations through the words that he used at Davos yesterday and the approach of sort of delivering this broadside to Trump?
You know something? 100% supportive, because I've been saying it from day one, before Prime Minister Carney even got elected last year. I was out in front of the Canadian people saying we have to diversify our trade. We have to find new partners around the world, reliable partners, democratically elected governments. That's who we need to work with. And we need to, move that forward as quickly as possible. As for investments here in Canada, in particular in Ontario, we need to see action. We need to start moving quicker. We hear a lot of talk, but we need to see results. Talk is cheap. We want to see results.
Hi, Premier Jeff Gray, Globe and Mail. Wanted just to ask you a little bit about that. We know you didn't get a heads up on the decision that the Prime Minister made with regard to China, but would it have been typical in your relationship with him to have, can you give examples of past decisions or announcements where you would have spoken in advance about something of that magnitude, something that impacted Ontario? Would you have had a conversation with him? Is that what you would have expected?
Well, we had a great relationship, and I hope we still have a great relationship. But when you don't inform someone in their number one sector that you're going to cut a deal that could, as Flavio said, would cost one full shift, where are those 50,000 jobs coming from? It's going to come from one of our assembly plants. It's just being respectful. Before we do anything, and if it has anything to do with the federal government, we consult, we speak to them. But just all of a sudden to get a 2-hour notice phone call that they're going out to release something, and my friends behind me, the same thing happened to them. They got the last minute call, oh, I'm sorry, the deal is done, and this is what's happening. Unacceptable.
Could we hear that from one of them?
Sure, absolutely. Whoever wants to speak. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that the challenge here, obviously, and by the way, we represent seafood workers in Eastern Canada, so they definitely needed relief. None of this is easy in terms of how you reach a deal with a mammoth like China. But the reality is, were there not other things that we could have been doing here to make sure that we weren't doing this in terms of what has happened around the vehicle side of things? We have been clear to the government of our position on this. We've made numerous submissions. We've been clear before they went to China that, we needed to make sure that we were protecting the auto industry in any discussions over there. And of course, all of you were reporting out before the Prime Minister went to China regarding the fact of what was on the table. I mean, everyone in the world was aware of this. The point being is that we need to go into these negotiations and make sure that we are putting our best foot forward, protecting everyone that we can, but not getting caught into this situation where we're trading off one part of the country for the other, one sector for the other. If we're going to have a true Team Canada approach here, we have to be able to bring people to that conversation ahead of time. Maybe there are ways that we can, yes, influence, but maybe there's also another deal that can be had when people who understand the industry are actually providing that input. If I could carry on, I would say to you one very important thing about the Prime Minister's speech last night. There were many important things. But his call to action by middle powers in the world to come together and form an alliance to be able to, in some way, push back around what we are seeing from the United States right now, I believe is critically important. That is what we needed to see last year when the U.S. first launched its trade war against Canada and the world. We needed to see a coalition of the willing coming together to be able to form a fortress to be able to push back. And hopefully we are in a place where that can happen now, which can change some of the conditions of what we're seeing in terms of trade negotiations with the United States. I would also add that the cake is baking in the United States right now. Their economy is suffering, particularly their manufacturing part of their economy. The very thing that Donald Trump said that he was going to make better is actually worse because of these tariffs. Tariffs on aluminum, on steel, on the auto sector are all impacting workers in the United States right now too. So the conditions that he is dealing with in the United States are starting to change in this moment. Like many of you and like our Prime Minister, I'm very concerned about the condition that we find ourselves in the world. But that doesn't mean that we take our eye off what we have to do here in Canada, which is we have to support Canadian workers through this. We have to make sure that we have strong industrial policy that does support Canadian workers, and that's where we need to keep our focus. And we have to be aware that trading off one sector for the other in Canada is going to leave at least one sector very unhappy, and in this case, a very big sector that contributes a lot to the Canadian economy. So,
just a quick follow-up for the Premier. Premier, the Globe's reporting today that GFL is moving its head office to the United States. Did the CEO contact you? Do you have concerns about that move?
He did contact me. He's not moving the head office down to the U.S. He's moving, opening an office, I should say, and they're still going to be employing thousands and thousands of people here. They're a global company.
Premier Tina with City News. The parents of a 7-year-old who died in December here at Queen's Park today, their son Max was nonverbal with autism and couldn't attend school full-time because there weren't enough supports. Families have raised this issue for years. Why hasn't your government ensured students with special education needs can attend school full-time?
Well, actually, let me just go back to the Liberal government when they were in power, and it was in the first month that I was in office that the whole system had no money. They didn't have anything. They weren't investing. It was approximately about $200 million. We've increased funding to $700 million to families. It's going to be, as I always say, it's continuous improvement, but we're funding more than any government in the history of our province, and we're going to continue to fund it.
But Premier, your government has been in power for 8 years. Educational assistants are still in short supply right across Ontario. Will you direct your education minister to make hiring and retaining EAs a priority this year?
Well, we are. We're actually going to be hiring 6,000 educators on both sides, actual educators, EAs. Again, we're funding it at an unprecedented amount. We're looking at making sure that we have enough teachers. We're looking at Teachers College dropping it from 2 years down to 1 year, and we're trying to push it for September to attract more people into the education system. You know, I want to thank our teachers, our educators, our EAs. It's a very, very tough job, and we are hiring more educators.
Morning, Premier. Rob Ferguson, Toronto Star.
Hi, Rob.
Just wondering, the concerns you all raised this morning, we've been aware of them since, I guess, at least last Friday, when it looked like this deal was happening. Other than your initial conversation, which I think you said was with Dominic LeBlanc, was
Yes.
the one who called you, have you or anyone else up here had any communications with the federal government on this to give you feedback on what you're saying?
Well, I'll speak for myself. I've talked to Melanie Joly a few times, as of this morning as well. But as far as I know, none of us have talked to the Prime Minister.
Okay. Are you getting it? What did you hear from her?
Well, I guess she was concerned, in my opinion, that we're coming out here to do a press conference. You know, where was the phone call from the Prime Minister? It takes about 3 seconds to make a phone call or a text message. None of us received anything. So we're going to sit down. She'll come by on Monday, and we'll have a conversation on how the federal government plans to support our workers. This is all about our workers. This is all about the 500,000 families that are relying on the auto sector to put food on their table, to pay the rent, to pay a mortgage. That's what we're focused on.
All right. And what do you make of the fact that it sounds like you haven't had any kind of a meaningful, engaging response yet, despite it being almost a week? So what do you make of that?
You know something, I'm focused on the workers. I'm going to make it very clear when I'm in Ottawa to visit the Prime Minister with the rest of the premiers. And I think everyone knows I won't be holding back. But I do look forward to going to Ottawa on Wednesday and having a little chat with them.
Hi, Jessica from the Trillium. And this question is to anybody who'd like to answer it, including the Premier. Do you believe the Prime Minister has given up on an integrated Canada-US auto industry? And if so, is that reasonable given what President Trump has said and done?
Well, I hope he hasn't, and I haven't talked to him about it, but I truly believe they want to support the sector. That's my opinion. Did they go upon this deal in the wrong way? 1,000%. You can't just make deals and not consult with the 4 people standing here that, work with the auto sector, work with the people on the floor. You know, Lana goes around plants, and I know Brian does and Flavio does, talking to the frontline people. It gives them uncertainty. It gives them uncertainty as simple as saving enough money to maybe buy a home. Now they're concerned. So we'll do everything we can to support the auto sector.
Would anyone
Anytime if anyone wants to jump in, Flavio.
We didn't agree that doing a deal with access for Chinese vehicles without a tariff was a good part of the overall automotive strategy. But we're in close talks with the federal government, led by Melanie Joly, on what a renewed automotive strategy looks like in this new world, where we're not sure we're going to get tariff-free access return to the U.S. and what's possible for automotive manufacture and exports from this country. Like Lana said, and like Brian says all the time, the oceans eat up the profit margins on export. And so this isn't as a flexible an industry to pivot on, but we're certain we're going to see an automotive strategy, a new one in a short time. We've had a lot of input into that. I don't typically talk to the Prime Minister, that's the Premier, but his team is well engaged, and we're looking for something in that auto strategy that recalibrates given the concession of 3% of the market that we made right now to non-market players that we typically warned against. Thanks.
Okay, to follow up for the Premier, I kind of can't believe I'm asking this, but it's to try to see where you would draw the line with President Trump. He has threatened Greenland. If the U.S. does invade, do you believe that Canada should help defend it, or should it not, to avoid any economic retribution?
Well, what I understand, President Trump said he's not going to use military force, which is the best thing I've heard come out of his mouth in a long time. That's a NATO country. We stand by our NATO partners, and I'm glad to hear that President Trump decided not to exercise military force.
Premier, Moira Welsh, Toronto Star. Change the subject a bit. I have a question about the Skills Development Fund. The government launched its second lawsuit against a recipient of the fund, asking for millions of dollars back. There are two lawsuits now filed, and I'm wondering what you think about the message that this sends, given that there were questions raised during the application process. How do people trust that the fund is actually doing the checks and balances?
Well, this is a perfect example. We've given out over 1,000 projects, 1,012 to be exact, and there's two bad actors. It shows the system works. If you're going to file for a project, you better make sure that you're spending it correctly, because if not, we're coming after you. Simple as that. And it shows the system works. The SDF is an incredible program. It's trained 750,000 people, including people in the auto sector. And we're going to be training another 250,000. There's over 100,000 people that ended up getting jobs. So always think of this. If you get a grant from the provincial government and you aren't following the guidelines, we're coming at you. And there's always a couple bad actors. Again, there's over 1,000 projects moving forward.
To follow up, do you know how many forensic audits there are related to the funding, and if there are any other lawsuits coming down the pipe?
I just know of the two that you just mentioned. But again, I'd love to see 100%. But when you fund 1,012 projects and you have two bad apples, well, they're going to be held accountable. But the good news is the system works. That's what happens. So that's the message to anyone that gets funds for anything, and we give out a lot of grants. You better make sure you're doing what you say you're going to do.
Morning, Premier Richard Southern, 680 News Radio. The Finch West LRT has repeatedly gone out of service. I think it's once every 2 or 3 days when you average it out since it began running in late December, and it wasn't able to operate at all during last week's snow. Yeah. What are you doing to fix this? And frankly, have Ontarians bought a lemon with this line, sir?
Well, as you know, we've handed over the TTC, but in saying that, Metrolinx is working collaboratively with the TTC to fix any of the issues, and we're going to continue working to fix any issues. And I'm pretty confident they're going to have things fixed very shortly.
Also, if I could, Premier, I wanted to ask your guests if they could weigh in on if you guys agree with the Premier's contention that the Chinese-made vehicles to be sold in Ontario will be spy cars, as the Premier puts it, that they will eavesdrop essentially on your phone conversations. Do you agree with the Premier?
Sorry, I jumped forward because I'd be happy to take this, because the question is about the technology that are in the vehicles. And in China, the Chinese federal government has restricted Teslas made in the USA from radiuses close to government buildings and military installations. They know that these vehicles that are packed with hundreds of sensors and over-the-air updates are a risk, just like any of our connected technologies are. The question about the Chinese versus what others have brought forward as examples, like my cell phone made by Foxconn in Shenzhen, is that the tech stacks in these vehicles that do the over-the-air updates have their destination for that information in China. And as we look at our relationship, our wider relationship with China, a country whose industrial policy has been hostile to ours, we've been very careful from a cybersecurity point of view. So with vehicles, and I've published on this 2 years ago, the solution for the Chinese with Tesla is to have Tesla tech stacks that are housed in China. And the solution for Canadians through Transportation Canada, through the CMVSS process that these vehicles are going to get certified, must also include, from a cyber point of view, controls over where that data gets transmitted to and where it gets housed. I think it's a question that Canadians and Canadian companies answer every day with their valuable data. And it's not fantastical to think that the vehicles with the highest concentration of the technology that collects geospatial, behavioral data, the Premier talked about phone calls, but it really is about transmission from encrypted phones to other encrypted phones that go through somebody else's tech stack, then are vulnerable. I think the Chinese are kind of on the forefront of this. They've been able to use their own regulations to make sure that Teslas aren't spying on Chinese government. We shouldn't be naive about the reciprocal arrangement.
Question from the Premier. It's Melissa Shin from Bloomberg News. Jameson Greer, U.S. Trade Representative, was asked about the Canada-China trade deal on Bloomberg Television. He said, "I am focused on the suggestion about Chinese investment into Canada and that kind of thing. I'm not sure that's healthy for the North American relationship, so we'll be looking at that." What's your reaction to those remarks?
I've met Jameson Greer, very smart individual, was part of the last USMCA. If there was anyone that understands the auto sector, it's Jameson, and I agree with him. It's harmful to the North American auto market, no matter if it's Canada, the U.S., or Mexico.
Okay, and a follow-up for anyone who wants to answer this. One of the reasons that some consumers are very excited about the Chinese EVs is the low price. What can the Canadian auto industry do to improve affordability for Canadian-made electric cars?
Well, first of all, get rid of the emissions mandate. Make sure that the federal government is supporting and funding technology and supporting our auto workers. And, something at what cost? Maybe a few people might buy them, and I discourage anyone from buying a Chinese vehicle. But if they decide to do that, at what cost? Is it at the cost to your neighbor down the street that's working in the auto sector that he's not going to have or she's not going to have a job? You got to look at more of a Team Canada approach. And wherever they're working, if they went and outsourced their jobs, they wouldn't be too happy. So, folks, this is time to band together, Team Canada. That's what we need to focus on. Take care of each other. Well, we're being attacked on two fronts. We're being attacked by China. We're being attacked by Trump. This is all the more reason we have to diversify our trade to countries that we're doing great work with. I'll give you an example. Volkswagen in Germany. Hopefully Germany can come or Volkswagen or a German car can come and manufacture here. They built the fourth largest building in the world, 16 million square feet in St. Thomas. Or Korea, where Hyundai and Kia are selling 220,000 vehicles into Canada. Come and invest. We'll support you. That's what we need to do. Start diversifying and stop relying on their American friends so much.
Hey, Premier Barbara with QP Briefing. I'm just wondering, you're being very vocal about the fact that you didn't like the deal the PM made with China, but it's done, right? So on the provincial level, are you considering perhaps bringing forward any kind of legislation to protect the EV industry in Ontario this spring or anything of the sort?
Well, put it this way, everything's on the table. What I want to do is focus on the auto workers. I want to make sure that we continue to invest. We've seen over $46 billion of investment last year into our auto sector with support from the provincial government and the federal government. And we want to see that support continue to make sure that our auto workers can thrive and prosper and grow. That's what we need to focus on.
And I'm just thinking as well, the opposition has been calling out the fact that you called off the Ontario EV rebates program when your government took place. And, you know, recently you have been really advocating for the EV industry here. So I'm wondering if you would consider bringing back this rebate, and then if maybe Flavio, you can step forward and explain how much of a difference the rebate would make.
Well, first of all, when I got elected close to 8 years ago compared to now, we didn't have Volkswagen building a 16 million square foot building or the battery plant down in Windsor. Things have changed. We were out in front rather than giving people individual rebates. We invested billions and billions of dollars in the 2 battery plants to create thousands of jobs and reciprocal jobs on top of that. At least we see a return on our investment. Pass it over to you.
Some of you may know me from a former role where I worked at Queen's Park at Economic Development. When we came up with the EV rebates, the idea then was to kind of get the EV adoption off the mat. We learned in that process that we were giving $14,000 to millionaires who were buying Porsche 918 Spyders and buying $130,000 Teslas. When the Premier took over, one of the first meetings that we had, we talked about that rebate program, and I said if the rebate program has a $100 million tag, that $100 million is better invested in making the components for EVs in Ontario. And then let's see what happens after we have domestic capacity here to see if we need to recalibrate that. Those rebates came in when EV sales were less than 1%. And even now, as they're diving, they're around 9%. There is some conversation with the feds about doing that. I think that if the sector here is going to benefit from getting Canadians to buy EVs, one of the things that we've suggested to the feds is look at the VIN number on the car. And if it starts with a 2, it was made in Canada. And then look at the companies that make cars here. And if that car is made by a company that make cars here, but from one of their American factories that has a lot of Canadian content on them, that should be a priority as well. The provinces being in that business is a bonus. But if the federal government isn't in that business and out of the EV mandate business where we give credits that are convertible to companies that have no Canadian footprint, then it really doesn't matter. And I say this with respect to the Premier. It doesn't matter whether there's an Ontario rebate or not. It's not using the full strength of the 2 million Canadian market vehicle sales.
Premier, yesterday the federal agriculture minister Heath MacDonald said that the reason the tariffs with China are time stamped is because Canada still has a tariff on Chinese steel. That suggests that maybe the federal government is considering lifting that tariff. Are you worried, given the state of the steel industry here in this province, that we could be seeing Chinese steel dumped on our shores again after in the next round of sort of concessions with Beijing?
You know something, that would be an absolute disaster for the steel sector, bringing in cheap Chinese steel. We're already bringing in cheap Chinese steel from other areas. And I don't want to get too complicated, but there's a quota system. You bring in steel. At one time it was 60%. The federal government knocked it down to 50%. So anything over and on top of 50% that they bring in, then they have to pay a tariff. But all I'm saying, and I've said it until I'm blue in the face to the Prime Minister, bring that quota down to 25%. Let our steel sector across the country, not just here in Ontario, but across the country, thrive. It's a no-brainer. They're dumping cheap, matter of fact, they're dumping cheap Chinese steel now. They're just slapping other stickers on it and saying made in X country, but they're actually getting cheap Chinese steel, dumping it in here. And we've passed legislation that all the municipalities and the province have to use, first, Ontario products, building materials, secondly, Canadian building products, and then if they can't find either across the country, then they have the option to go out to other countries. But they should not be moving forward with free tariffs for Chinese steel. You might as well, my goodness, it'd be a disaster.
And back on EVs, Premier, is it your sense, given that the Carney government already put a pause on the previous Trudeau government's EV mandate for, the 20% and going up to 60% in 2030, and then eventually 100% of new cars would have to be EVs. Is it your sense that that's a concession that you will win from Mélanie Joly next week? That the federal government already looks like they're leaning in the direction that you have been calling for them to lean to for quite some time.
Well, thanks for that question. It's not about me winning or losing. It's about the auto sector winning, and my three colleagues will tell you very clearly, when they plan a vehicle, it's 4 years out. And you can't have uncertainty. You have to have certainty. Get rid of the EV mandate. Let the market dictate rather than the government always dictating. That's the best way to do business in any single sector.
Hi, Premier Josh Freeman with CP24.
Hi.
I'm just wondering, if you do have to live with this deal, what options does your government have to respond? Essentially, what can you do?
Well, we're going to, first of all, sit down next Wednesday face to face with the Prime Minister and the other premiers. I want to find out what is the big auto deal that they have here for Ontario to protect auto workers. This is all about protecting our workers. And I'll see what they have to say, then we'll respond appropriately.
Okay, and you said earlier this week that if Chinese companies were to manufacture vehicles in Ontario, that wouldn't be viable because they wouldn't be exportable to the U.S. Can you see a condition or anything that would change that? And I wonder if any of your colleagues here would care to weigh in.
I'll make a comment, then I'll pass it over to my colleagues behind me. The numbers just don't add up. And even if they do start assembling, how about the supply chain? They come and they assemble, but they bring all Chinese parts in. That means nothing. We want to make sure we produce Canadian cars by Canadians with the R&D and the specs and everything, and the steel and the aluminum from Canada. It's as simple as that. But I'll pass it over to
Thank you. The idea that a Chinese company would come to Canada, come to Ontario, invest and build vehicles is fundamentally false for the simple reason that I outlined at the outset. We have an industry because since the 1960s in the Auto Pact, we created an integrated North American market so manufacturers can sell into a market that buys about 20 million vehicles a year. A Chinese company setting up a facility here to build a plant, which typically builds 300,000 cars a year, to sell only in Canada, doesn't make commercial sense. If they were to come and do this anyway, it would be because of mass subsidization coming from the Chinese central government to put secure a foothold here in Canada, which I think presents real risks for our ongoing relationship with the United States. So I don't think it's feasible or realistic. We should be focusing on the 5 OEMs that we have here now. Canada's in a very fortunate position to have 5 companies that build cars, assemble parts in this country. Let's support them before we start going out and talking about bringing in Chinese investment into Canada. Thanks.
This will be the last reporter.
Hi, Premier. Colin DeMello from Global News. Just a few from me. You've been talking about it returning to a Team Canada approach and a unified approach. I'm wondering, how does that square with your threat to remove Crown Royal from the LCBO when 2 provinces, Manitoba and Quebec, are both asking you to change your mind? How's that Team Canada?
Well, of course, they're asking me to change my mind because find out what would happen if Crown Royal closed their plants and go down to Alabama. As simple as that. But I gave an olive branch to Diageo, and Diageo are the owners of Crown Oil. Show me a plan that's going to replace those jobs, and then we're good. But you can't take jobs out of a small town in Ontario that's been around for 100 years and say, come and support me. I notice their advertising's, they're bumping the advertising up. But folks, we have other great whiskey manufacturers that are employing people right here in Ontario. Let's focus and support them. But if Diageo comes and says, I'm going to replace these 200 workers by manufacturing bottles, doing their cartons, doing other things, more advertising, so on and so forth, and they can show me on paper then we'll sit down and I'll be open. I'm pretty easygoing. My whole job, Colin, is to protect the people. That's my one single area of focus, is to protect the people. And sometimes, does it get nasty when they take jobs away? 100% it does, because I'm responsible at the end of the day. And we're fighting on a couple fronts. So we're going to do everything we can to make sure that we invest here in Ontario. You know, the Prime Minister was mentioning they have a strong balance sheet. Well, that's good news that they have a strong balance sheet. Then start investing, start moving things forward, start focusing on the national defense. That we need to start building more tanks down with UNIFOR members down in London. And there's other areas too. So we need to focus on that.
I'm going to ask you about Chinese-made EVs in a moment, but I wanted to ask you about housing starts. Ontario in 2025 saw 62,000 housing starts. That is the lowest since your government promised to build 1.5 million homes by 2031. What are you going to be doing next to either incentivize buyers or the home building industry to construct more?
And that's the reason we're here. I'm out there fighting for Ontario jobs, that people can bring home a paycheck, that will be able to afford, maybe buy a townhome, a condo, or even a detached house. This is about giving people certainty. And we've poured billions and billions of dollars into enabling infrastructure for municipalities. There has to be a time that the municipalities start contributing, lowering DCs. I've always been an advocate of getting rid of the HST for everyone. We did it for first-time home buyers, but obviously that didn't move the needle, which I predicted it wouldn't move the needle. Let's open it up to anyone who wants to buy a new home, a new build. Right now, you know, we're seeing two massive infernos happening. One inferno is the auto sector, and the other inferno is the construction sector. Let's get rid of the DCs, run your municipalities properly, and make sure that we get rid of the HST, that the federal government needs to follow us. So if you get rid of the DCs, folks, it goes up to 30% of the cost, even 40, I've heard. So I'm going on the low end, 30% of DCs. That alone on $1 million home, it'll reduce it by $300,000. And then if you get rid of the 13% HST, that lowers it by another $130,000. You watch the market would boom. But we need the buy-in from the federal government to open the HST up to anyone who wants to buy a home. I have mentioned this to the Prime Minister. You know, well, there might be a loss in revenue. Well, let me tell you the loss of revenue. 0 plus 0 equals 0. We have unemployed construction workers that need to start building homes. But if you don't create the environment and the certainty to the public, it's not going to happen.
And just finally on Chinese-made EVs, a moment ago you said you're discouraging Canadians from buying one of the 49,000. Are you officially asking Canadians, Ontarians to boycott any of the 49,000 Chinese-made EVs that come to Canada?
That is exactly what I'm saying, Colin. So thank you for that.
Say the word. Sorry, you're asking them to
boycott the Chinese EV vehicles. Support companies that are building vehicles here. It's as simple as that. This is a Team Canada approach. We got to stick together. As simple as you know, as supporting. And when you go out, buy a company. It doesn't necessarily. Toyota builds 500,000 cars, and Stellantis is building, and GM, and so on and so forth. Support the companies that support us. It doesn't have to be the exact product, but if at least we're supporting them, they're going to stay in Ontario. And Colin, I want to thank you for asking me about the gun buyback as well. So, you know, this gun buyback, I stand with my other premiers, no matter if it's Premier Smith in Alberta, Premier Moe in Saskatchewan, or Premier Wab Canoe, and myself, and I'm sure our great Premier in Newfoundland. I'm not speaking for them or Nova Scotia, but they're like-minded. A lot of hunters up in Nova Scotia. I can tell you one thing, folks. When I go out there, I've never, ever once heard someone come up to me and say, you know those law-abiding hunters? Let's go take their guns. I've never heard that. What I hear a dozen times a day, no matter where I go, I feel so unsafe in our city. I'm scared to go out at night. I'm scared to go and hop on the subway. My kids are up all night thinking someone's going to kick in the door and put a gun to our head, an illegal gun that is coming across the border. That's what they're worried about. So my recommendation, stop wasting money at the federal government. Let's start focusing on getting your bail reform that you made a big deal about. We're doing bail. You still haven't passed it. How about mandatory sentences? So when someone does kick in your door and put a gun to your head and then gets arrested and the judge says, oh, little Johnny, you made a mistake. On the fourth time he's out on bail. You go out and do it again. There's zero consequences. The number one issue outside of jobs and the economy in every poll I've seen is safety. People are scared. People are terrified. And you're focusing on the wrong group. These are, imagine if you go and register for your firearms, you think those people are going out and robbing stores and kicking in doors? Those aren't the people. Start focusing on the bad guys, not on the good guys, the bad guys. You're missing the whole point on that. I support legal gun owners, hunters, because they're responsible. They keep their guns locked up. They keep their ammunition separate. They only use their guns when they're going hunting. And they use every bit of meat that they end up harvesting. I don't like using killing, but harvesting. And our First Nations communities, they're incredible. They rely on that. And you're going to say, well, they're exempt. Well, I stand with the other premiers. Stop the nonsense and start focusing on real crime. Don't say, oh, these guys are the bad. No, they aren't the bad. They're the good guys. So I support law-abiding hunters and gun owners. So thank you, everyone. God bless the people of Ontario. I want to thank my colleagues here. Let's keep fighting for Canadians, for Ontarians, and we're in a battle. But we have the greatest, the smartest people in the entire world. We can compete against anyone. So thank you so much, everyone.